Hey, it's Kriger here, and this is the third part of my Conquer the Poor and Puer Aeternus series. And today we're going to explore how the mother and father complex shapes our religious views and how a childish attitude toward the unconscious can be fatal, forcing us to confront God's dark side. And this whole series is based on my book Pistis Demystifying Jungian Psychology, and you can claim your copy when you join my newsletter down below. So another deeply important facet of the Puer complex is how it impacts our concept of God. There is this guy called John Marcomer that has a very interesting notion, and he says that our idea of God shapes who we are. And this is very aligned with what we understand as God in Jungian psychology, being the most important factor that ends up driving all of our behaviors and decisions. So what happens is that the mother and father complex, these imagos, are projected upon God, upon our notion of the divine. And now we tend to recreate the same relationship dynamics we experienced with our parents, or better put, our inner parents, with God. So in this light, having experienced toxic shame and then compensating with extreme perfectionism is especially poisonous for our relationship with the divine, because this attitude makes us feel constantly punished, unworthy, and often abandoned. Because we have this belief that if we are not immaculate in everything that we do, well, then we are one step closer to experiencing God's wrath. And as a coping mechanism, many people develop religious OCD to compensate for these feelings, since it brings this illusory sense of control. And by the way, I'm assuming you understand the basics of how the mother and father complex can basically shape our entire lives. And if you're unfamiliar with it, I'll link the whole playlist over here and also down below. I strongly suggest that you watch it after this video. So that said, the parental complex, especially the father imago, since he's a representative of the spirit, constantly interferes with our religious views. And if they aren't addressed, we are left with a childish and incomplete view of God. And this immaturity also makes puers and puellas easy praise for cults, since the parental imagos are projected onto a guru. And in doing so, they exempt themselves from making choices, taking responsibilities, and basically having to think for themselves. So naturally, many want to experiment with untraditional paths. The problem is that their incessant longing for the eternal mother constantly betrays them and frequently takes the form of obsessive and compulsive spiritual pursuits. And in fact, many make their mission to pursue their ego death or Kundalini awakening. And eventually, many achieve these experiences. But the problem is that the results are nothing like the eternal bliss. It's the exact opposite. Because after you experience a brief moment of relief and, let's say, enlightenment, you are left with no motivation whatsoever to continue living your life. You're taken by this state of apathy, depression, anxiety, and extreme isolation. And in worst cases, there's a psychotic outbreak. And now people are plagued by weird visions and persecutory fantasies. And for the longest time, I asked myself why this happens. And honestly, I spent a long time researching this topic. Because I thought that, let's say, every spiritual pursuit should elevate you to a state of happiness. But I found out that the main problem is that for a childish ego, getting in touch with the unconscious has a disintegrating effect on the personality. And once again, von Franz explains that obsessive spiritual pursuits conceal a deep desire to escape from the responsibilities of the adult life. So much so that Robert Bly constantly jokes about this condition in his lectures, calling people flying boys or flying girls. And I confess that I also had a period in my life where I was definitely a flying boy, but this is a story for another time. So this spiritual compulsion can also be immensely amplified when spirituality also becomes a coping mechanism to deal with traumatic influences and something Carl Jung calls moral confrontation. And this often takes the form of magical thinking and spiritual bypassing. So in the first case, people believe they can erase generations of trauma by lighting a candle, following a guided meditation on YouTube, or doing one energy healing session with this real shaman via Zoom. I mean, yeah, people do some crazy stuff, man. But the truth is that healing is a construction and not a one-time thing. And it requires a series of practices anchored in reality. And as Jung says, time is an irreplaceable factor for healing. And we will cover that in the next video. Now, in the second case, people use spiritual practices and ideas to avoid uncomfortable emotions and necessary confrontations. And these tend to mingle with toxic positivity, and as soon as they feel something, they immediately shut it down. And there's a tendency to dissociate, and if this is taken to an extreme, psychotic symptoms can also appear, since the dissociated part often takes over the conscious personality. Moreover, these spiritual pursuits tend to be empty, and people acquire a false knowledge that lacks real experience. It's only an intellectual exercise and pure mental masturbation. And beliefs like we only have the now, everything is transient, the real world is an illusion, nothing matters, or I must kill my ego, are especially poisonous, as they tend to fuel an elaborate scheme that to justify not growing up. And this enmeshment with the unconscious also evokes a feeling that you know something is special that others don't. And you feel secretly superior. But this also creates loneliness, since this is based on, on pure childish arrogance. Because trying to possess the unconscious always opens the door for psychic inflation. And now we see all sorts of crazy stuff, like people thinking they're the next incarnation of Jesus. And in extreme cases, this excessive contact with the unconscious turns the longing for the eternal mother into death fantasies. And sadly, many succumb to it, as there is a tendency to romanticize death and suffering. Now, let me be absolutely clear that I'm not advocating against spiritual pursuits, because once more, the problem is a childish attitude toward the unconscious. Because when you refuse life and its practical aspects, the unconscious quickly turns dark and devouring. Moreover, when you use spirituality to avoid moral confrontation, the shadow always has its revenge. Conversely, a strong ego complex gives you solid roots in reality and acts as a counterpoint to the unconscious. It allows you to safely engage with it and maintain an objective perspective without being engulfed by it. So a strong ego gives you the ability to confront the unconscious material, elaborate it, and integrate it into your life. Because without the ego, we are bound to face the ruthless disintegrating facet of the unconscious. Also, having strong ego complex is what allows you to have self-confidence, motivation, and a sense of direction. Because the individuation process only occurs when the conscious mind directs the process. And the notion of building a healthy ego is so central to Jung that he divides our lives into two stages with two different goals. So there's a famous quote from the book Psychotherapy that I'll put on the screen right now. So basically, Jung says that the first half of life is meant to seek expansion, build a healthy ego, dedicate ourselves to learning a craft, have a profession, and build relationships. So the neurosis of a young person occurs mainly because he refuses to grow up and individuate from his parents. In other words, he's a Puer Aeternus or a Puer Aeternus. Now, in contrast, the second half of life is meant to enrich the inner world, develop gifts that were left behind, and let go of a youthful attitude that's now out of season. So the neurosis of an older person occurs mainly because they resist letting go of their persona and developing their spirit. Now, before we conclude this video, let me tell you that you can find a step-by-step to integrate the shadow and conquer the Puer and Puer Aeternus in my accessible course Catabasis, the Shadow Integration Manual. Also, if you'd like to work one-on-one with me, I also invite you to check my mentorship. Links down below. So now let's return to the context of his spirituality. A great part of maturing is developing our relationship with the divine, free from parental influence and childish beliefs. It's interesting that atheism might be a valid position before religion, but psychologically it's impossible. And let's remember that psychologically, God means the highest value operative in a human soul, or the imago Dei. In other words, it's the foundation that shapes our lives and who we are. And in the absence of a deeper meaning that guides us, the religious function of the psyche replaces it with something else. So when we hold childish views and don't actively strive to find or create a deeper sense of meaning, traumas become mighty gods, drugs controls us, money and sex become our masters, codependency substitutes our relationship with the self, and narcissism turns into a religion. And that's why Carl Jung says that healing is a religious problem. Not because he wants to create a new religion, but because only the numinous can revitalize our souls and help us find meaning. Ultimately, we are free to choose our gods, but remember that this decision shapes who we become. So finally, the Puer Aeternus tell the story of an unrealized potential and a half-lived life. And healing lies in facing reality and working on developing your gifts and being service of others. And I teach you how to do this in the next part.